Welcome to the podcast. Our guest today is the Managing Director of DNA Testing Choice, which is a news and reviews site for at-home DNA testing. Maybe it would be accurate to call it the Yelp of genetic testing. I've heard that before. So Craig McPherson is the Managing Director of DNA Testing Choice, the Yelp for DNA testing. Is that accurate, Craig? Would you call it that?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not that familiar with Yelp, so I tend to call it the TripAdvisor of DNA testing, but yeah, you got it.
Yeah, wonderful. So can you tell us why you decided to start DNA Testing Choice in the first place? When did you do it, and why did you decide to start it?
Sure. Well, I'd always had an interest in genetics, but at the beginning of my career, I spent my time at Microsoft and a few tech startups, very much in the sort of advertising industry. But 2013, my grandfather was suffering with some pretty bad, pretty progressed Alzheimer's, and I took an interest in the fact that was, genetically heritable, and I began to do a bit of research, and I found that the DNA tests available on the internet were very confusing. I knew that you could commission, certain DNA tests if you had a family history, but that was normally, expensive and lengthy. So a quick DNA test was appealing. And I remember I found about 40 different tests that you could buy on the internet. And this was globally. In 2013, and it struck me that a sort of a comparison site model could be really helpful. And although I was initially planning to do a comparison site for DNA tests that help tell you about what disease you might suffer with in the future, it seemed to me that many of the companies producing these tests were doing ancestry, health, and even, much older tests using the 1970s technology for like paternity testing and DNA testing for immigration. So I just decided, let's just map every single DNA test that you can buy on the internet on this site, and start reviewing them. So I spent a great deal of money. I took every single test on the market, and I wrote a review of each. I am not a geneticist, so I wrote it from the perspective of just a normal person, what was clear and what wasn't, what was good value for money. And having done a science degree, I was able to look at the genes that were being referenced by these companies and follow up with the research that had been linked to the result that I was seeing.
Yeah, so you took every test yourself in the early days. You bought them and paid for them. That's amazing.
Yeah, before I started the site, I spent tens of thousands of pounds taking every single test.
Wow, that's I remember the problem that you were describing at that time. I was doing my PhD and also noticed the gulf between kind of clinical genetic tests that could diagnose a family, something that was inherited through the family, and some of the more consumer-minded tests. And I remember having an epiphany that someone should start a Trustpilot or a Yelp or whatever you want to call it. And I remember Googling and finding DNA Test Choice and going, oh, good, someone actually thought of this 2 or 3 years ago. This is clearly not a new idea. I've not just done something amazing here. And I was amazed. I mean, at the time, the site had probably dozens of tests, thousands of reviews. Today, you've got millions of views probably, right? And thousands. I remember some of the tests have hundreds of reviews already. Is that, it's pretty popular?
Yeah. So to roll it back, so in the very beginning of 2014, there were 40 companies that were selling the tests, and between them, they probably sold about 300 tests. Including paternity tests, ancestry tests. And whereas today, there are over 300 companies selling DNA tests on the internet, and between them they sell 3,000 different tests. So that's been over 5 years. And on our site, Over 15,000 sort of members of the public have posted a review, and myself personally, I've taken, or my team members have taken, 300 tests now.
You are probably the most thoroughly genotyped person on the planet. Is that accurate?
Absolutely.
Wow. And so from 40 companies, 300 tests to 300 companies, 3,000 tests, what's the biggest change you've seen? Is it new kinds of tests, or is it people creating, minor updates or incremental updates on the same things? What's the biggest change you've seen over the last 4 or 5 years?
Definitely tests that don't require a biological sample. There was no such thing in 2013. You needed to provide a saliva sample or take a cheek swab, and you were even getting these Lancet devices where you'd put a drop of blood onto a piece of card and send that in. But there's been an explosion in tests that say if you already have raw data from taking another test like 23andMe, then just let us query that raw data and we'll give you additional results or different results. So that's been a huge change, and those sorts of tests that only require data are in many different forms. You've got mobile apps, you've got web apps. Some people will give you, PDF reports. Some people have got beautiful online interfaces where they'll share their results. So that's definitely been a big change. There's been an explosion in pet DNA testing. That's incredibly popular. And tests that show, non-health information. But the three biggest types of tests have always been health tests, tests to trace your ancestry, and paternity tests. But now there are tests that will give you your predisposition to personality traits. There are tests that will allow you to do genetic dating, so you meet people on the basis of your genes. All sorts of tests that will analyze your microbiome and the microbial community inside you. So there are so many different categories of tests now.
Yeah, so do you, I know you have expert reviews. Some of them come from people that are hired by DNA Testing Choice, some from kind of scientists, medical professionals, and then of course the open reviews. Do you ever see conflict between what scientists or medical professionals say versus what people say, what they like, what they find accurate, and how do you handle that sort of thing?
Well, it's interesting. So firstly, myself and my team, the ones who actually write these formal reviews, our editors' reviews as we call them, we have science degrees, but we are not geneticists. So we are not writing from the perspective of medical professionals. We're writing from the perspective of people who understand science to a certain level. We understand statistics, and a lot of genetic results are sort of inferential. And you do need to understand statistics, and we also understand what makes good research. Whether it's a peer-reviewed study, how many participants are on that study, and what makes poor research. A 200-person study of maybe one ethnicity and one gender that has not been peer-reviewed. And so we use that to follow up. But I do have, I frequently speak with medical professionals and geneticists and genetic counselors about consumer DNA tests. So do you want me to sort of share my experience from that perspective?
Yeah, it would be great to hear. I mean, I know there's always things coming out in the popular media where it's scientists or medical professional discussing either the merits or the challenges around testing, but I think probably you more than most probably have your finger on the pulse because of the sheer amount of data and number of people that are coming through your site. So it'd be really great to hear some of those insights.
Sure. So I would say one of the biggest reasons for the success of consumer genetic testing is marketing. a lot of companies and individuals, see the investment possibilities and throw, tens, if not hundreds of millions at genetic companies such as 23andMe and Ancestry.com that have very slick, TV advertising campaigns. So there's a beautiful veneer of marketing on top. When you actually look at the science, for example, ancestry testing, there's actually an individual, Professor Mark Thomas at UCL, who is an expert in where genetics meets human heritage, and he will quite clearly state that a lot of ancestry companies can't possibly say what they are trying to tell you, that you are 15% Iranian, that you are 25% Ashkenazi Jewish, that 1,000 years ago your family live in a small town in Scotland. So what's happening is you've got very clever marketers talking to in-house scientists about statistical likelihoods from just a handful of genetic markers, and then sort of building on top of that to say your ancestors, were Vikings, or you are related to Charlemagne or the Queen of England. And there's sort of a delicate, balance of likelihoods here, where marketers have license to sort of stretch the truth, and people are very eager to learn about themselves and their family, and they want to believe that they have these relations and their families did travel through, Iberia 100,000 years ago. But the very basic science in terms of ancestry testing, although it's very, very rich, and there's still a lot more to learn, it can't possibly tell you what modern genetic ancestry companies are trying to tell you that it tells you.
Yeah, so would it be fair to say that there's maybe a kind of tug of war going on between the scientists and the people that are out selling the tests, right? So the scientists want to say you're between 10 and 30% Norwegian, right? Maybe that's what the model says, or even Scandinavian. But the people who are selling the test would like to say you are 20% Viking, right? Because who doesn't want to? Nobody likes intervals, and we want to kind of tie it to a interesting and exciting story, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I wouldn't say it's so much say it's a tug of war. I would say, professional scientists who are not trying to sell tests, they will share that this is genetic astrology. This is buyer beware. That this is really a very small part of the whole genetic revolution, and that individuals are being told what they want to hear. And I think that many professional scientists who are, not involved in genetic testing, will say it's harmless, and if people want to spend their money in that way, then they can. To your point, it's not possible to say that you are 15%, Norwegian, and it's not possible to say that you are, between 30 and 0% Norwegian. The general understanding is that 200,000 years ago, Homo sapiens arose in sub-Saharan Africa. So if you want to know what your ancestry was 200,000 years ago, I can tell you you're 100% sub-Saharan African. If you want to know what your ancestry is today, and I assume your parents were born in the United States, then I would say that you are 100%, North American. You're 100% from the United States. So what the ancestry companies don't talk about is, okay, well, you may have, 15% Finnish ancestry, but was that 1 generation ago, 5 generations ago, 10,000 years ago, 100,000 years ago? The percentage of genetic markers that we possess and how they are linked to geographical regions is changing all the time. But ancestry companies will just give you a flat, you're 20% Western European, you're 7% Japanese, with absolutely, no discussion about the timescales involved, genetic drift and other major factors.
Yeah, I guess genetic drift doesn't really sell, does it? It's not the most. Yeah. I mean, I think I definitely share your viewpoint on this. What do you think is the what's the nugget, or what's the really exciting piece that, because there's a huge amount of conversation around genetic astrology and what's going wrong with some of these tests, but what do you think is what's the really exciting stuff that everybody's not paying enough attention to on the kind of consumer, direct to consumer testing? What's coming next, or what's already available now that you think actually really is both right for an individual to buy and the science is really good?
Yeah, well, I think consumer genetic testing, and let's take out relationship testing. Let's forget about paternity testing and sibling testing and forensic testing, and let's just stick with testing for health and ancestry. I think 5 to 10 years ago, when these tests were being produced, by and large, you would get one result per one genetic variant. So there would be a genetic variant analysed to do with how likely your tendons are to suffer injury, and based on that one genetic variant, you would get a paragraph of information that you are more or less likely to suffer injury when you train. Now, we, as we each have 30,000 genes with tens and tens and tens of millions of possible genetic variants that have an impact, and that it's incredibly rare that just one genetic variant in one gene makes such a major difference to how our body functions and grows. So come up to about 2015, 2016, companies that were saying, well, you have this genetic variant, which means you're more likely to respond to this drug, or that means you're more likely to suffer with Alzheimer's, of moving to a polygenic approach, and they take between dozens and hundreds of genetic variants to make a decision about what your likelihood is. And companies are developing algorithms to try and weight what your result should be based on the different impacts of these genetic variants. So what we're seeing is that companies are moving towards selling, we make the best algorithm, we've got the best scientific talent. And it's a shame, because although it's definitely a more accurate way of sharing your results, it also introduces a black box. Each company has a different black box that produces the result based on these hundreds, if not thousands, of factors. And for an individual to understand them, it's very difficult. I think that the ability to buy your whole genome sequence at such a low price, around $300-400, to get your full 2.8 billion base pairs, I think that is really interesting, because that is, depending on the quality of the data that will be useful, for the rest of your lifetime. And as these, algorithms are developed by these companies, and as we get more comfortable letting companies query our data, having your whole genetic data set on file that can be queried means you'll get best in market analysis, because there'll be so many more companies that can analyze it, and it will be a lot more convenient and virtually seamless. That said, what's in your DNA in terms of the genetic variants you possess are still only a tiny piece of the overall puzzle. You've got environmental sort of / non-genetic factors, and many genetic companies don't responsibly state that in your reports. And if you are looking to buy a DNA test, that's something you should be mindful of. But you also have expression data, the degree to which genetic variants are actually being expressed. And you've got epigenetic data where genes can be switched on or off. So there's a lot more to come in terms of what consumer genetic tests can tell us. And it can be argued that right now they are of minimal use, but they're only going to become more and more useful as time goes on.
Yeah, no, that's great. I think there's a couple interesting points in there. Number one, the whole genome sequencing is dropping so much that the price is dropping so much that diagnostics in rare disease is now becoming routine. And there's all sorts of other interesting applications like the polygenic risk scores that you mentioned that should hopefully allow us to be more predictive. I've seen some amazing research come out about predicting likelihood of cardiovascular disease, as well as likelihood of breast cancer that traditionally was single genes. On this kind of topic, whenever you think about predictive or preventive medicine and how this data is going to be used, who's generating it, it seems like there's growing concern around how is the data going to be used, who is accessing it, is it being sold, without someone's, maybe you've given permission by ticking the box, but it's not super clear. What are your thoughts on this? Do you have people leave comments or reviews that talk about data privacy? Do you think there should be stricter laws and regulations, or what do you where do you see that part of the field going?
Well, it's fascinating. I think we are in sort of the personal data revolution, where in the light of Cambridge Analytica, the Facebook scandal, we're realizing that our personal data is very valuable. I would say you've got some great protection if you're in Europe because of GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation. Then at any time you can write to any company and ask what data they hold on you. You can ask them to give you a copy of it, and it has to be in a portable format, so they can't just give you nonsense. And you can ask them to delete it, and they have to delete it. So certainly be aware of your rights if you're in Europe. And there is legislation in the US that says that you as an individual are entitled to any lab report that's generated about you. And you can get that directly from the lab, or if you go to the physician who commissioned it for you, they are duty bound to give you that data. They are legally bound to give you that data. When it comes to what tests you're going to buy, often in the terms and conditions, it's going to tell you what do they do with the biological sample once they've used it, and what do they do with your digital data. Many of them will say that you can ask for your biological sample to be destroyed. A few won't mention it, and if they don't, if this is something you're concerned about, then you should write and ask before you purchase the test. Many companies will say that we are going to use your data, but we're going to anonymize it, and we're only going to use it as part of a bigger set. And then we're going to sell it, and that's going to help us run our business, and researchers are going to use that data to create new treatments. And by the way, Mr. or Mrs. Consumer, you are not entitled to any royalties from any discovery that's made using your DNA. Now, that's an interesting one. A lot of people I've spoken with have said that a DNA data set that's anonymous really isn't worth much money. Maybe it's worth tens of dollars, forever in a one-off purchase. Where your genetic data becomes valuable is where you give your contact details along with it. Maybe you give your family history of breast cancer, or your circadian rhythms. Maybe you agree to be contacted every month about your gluten or lactose intolerance. It's really the data that comes along with that genetic data set that makes that genetic data set valuable. And at that point, you can sell your data for upwards of $1,000 every year to researchers and pharmaceutical companies. So from that perspective, that's a little bit about sort of tracking down your data, managing your data and your data rights. But there's another perspective, which is, and especially in North America, people are so afraid that the data is going to find its way onto the FBI database that we are frequently asked about this. And I've been to genetics exhibitions where people have said, even in Canada, we don't want the US government to get their hands on our data, so I would never take a DNA test. And there's definitely something interesting about that. In the case of the Golden State Killer, he was found because one of his relatives took an ancestry test. And so the evidence at the scene of one of those crimes, the genetic evidence, was then uploaded to an ancestry database, and the police were able to get in touch with that relative and subtly take an additional genetic sample from the suspect, match it to the original sample, and that's how they were able to catch that killer. So there is some truth that once your DNA is out there as part of a public database, then there are additional ramifications.
Yeah, and I've also heard actually similar concerns around data in national databases, for instance, just because if your country has a biobank, for example, and you trust your government now, there's no guarantee that in the future you might be taken over by a hostile government, right? So it's very hard, but at the same time, this data has incredible value to the healthcare system, right? We want to live in a world where we treat people before they're sick and not when they're after. So it seems like we've got a lot of figuring out to do as an industry of how we strike that balance between what people want, how their data should be treated, but also, a lot of the, especially patients who have conditions that we talk to as part of our work at Sano, they want their data to be used by researchers because it will help get closer to a treatment or a cure, but they also want to understand how it's being used. They don't want, like you say, it to be just kind of floating around on the internet. So obviously there's lots of different ideas and solutions out there, and we're just going to have to see how things go. Okay, so one final question here before we wrap up. I know we're running out of time. If we fast forward kind of 5 to 10 years, DNA testing choice will have tens of millions, maybe billions of hits. What do you think is the application for genetic testing that's going to rise above the rest? Call it 5 years, 10 years. When we look back, what's the thing that's going to really transform our lives when it comes to genetic testing?
I hate to be boring, but I would say personalized medicine. I think the rebel in me hopes that 5 years from now we'll be able to sequence ourselves as much as we want using a USB stick. We just stick it in our our laptop, and not only will that tell us about our whole genome sequence, but it will tell us about what genes are currently switched on and off, and how you can what you can actually do to flip those switches. I think epigenetic treatments are probably one of the most exciting things we have to look forward to know that you have a gene that makes your metabolism incredibly slow, and so you seem to put on a lot more weight than the next person, and then to be able to flip that switch so that your metabolism speeds up and you can be the weight that you want to be. I think that's that's fascinating. And in terms of how you treat certain diseases, we know that how you respond to drugs to do with blood pressure, for example, is incredibly genetic, and blood pressure medications are amongst some of the most used medications around the globe. And to know that you could be taking a medication that's 30% more or less effective just because of a genetic accident, and could therefore change that, is incredibly exciting. Not to mention with depression. For depression, it often takes 6 months to work out if you're on the right antidepressants, and you'll often do trial and error, and you might be working with a physician for 3 years before you find the right medication. But how you respond to antidepressants is also heavily genetic, and so a DNA test that can tell you, the best antidepressant that's going to work for you is literally going to change your life. So yeah, I think the advent of personalized medicine And epigenetics in the form of flipping those switches to sort of personalize your body are the most exciting things.
Oh, excellent. Okay, you heard it here first. Personalized medicine and epigenetic testing. Yeah, the point you made about pharmacogenomics, different people respond differently to drugs. We just started a study on our website a couple weeks ago where researchers noticed that some people, when they take aspirin, for example, they get stomach ulcers and other people don't. And there's they suspect that they have a lot of great data actually to suggest that it's genetics that are kind of driving this difference. So it's very interesting, and I think we've seen this in cancer treatments. The exact mutation of the tumor can change everything. So I love it. It's a idea that someday there will be one treatment per one person and not one treatment for millions of people. That's great. So if people want to get in touch with you, learn more about DNA testing choice, some of your other work, where should they find you? Twitter, DNA testing choice website, where's the best place?
Yeah, that's right. We're on Facebook, Twitter. The best thing to do is type DNA testing choice into Google, or you can go to dnatestingchoice.com. And we have full details on all of the 3,000 tests available online there. And you can also reach out to our team and ask any question you want about DNA testing, and we will do our best to help, whether it's trying to get someone to take a paternity test, or you want to know who your genetic romantic match could be.
Great. Maybe the romantic match is for another episode. I'm not convinced on the science on that one, but maybe you can convince me. All right. Thanks so much. Talk to you soon.